The morning sun filtered through the half-closed blinds, casting a soft, fragmented light across the kitchen counter. I moved through the routine motions of preparing breakfast, my hands finding their way to the coffee maker, the fridge, the bread, all on autopilot. My husband sat at the table, his eyes fixed on his phone, thumbs sliding up and down the screen with the hypnotic rhythm of disconnection. His coffee grew cold, a half-empty cup that mirrored the state of our marriage. We had built a life together that, on the surface, looked like the envy of many. A comfortable home, shared jokes at family gatherings, holiday photos that radiated contentment. But beneath that polished surface lay the sediment of unspoken disappointments and unmet needs. It wasn't that he was a bad husband. He wasn't. He provided, he listened, at least when he wasn't preoccupied with work. He even tried to initiate affection, but there was a hollowness to it, as if he were going through the motions, checking off a box on his to-do list. I craved more than just the touch of his hands. I needed the heat of his desire, the spark of genuine connection, and the feeling that I was seen, truly seen. The faucet's persistent drip became a metronome to my thoughts. At first it had been a soft percussion, a background noise easily ignored. But over the past few days, the drip turned into a steady, irritating reminder of everything that was wrong. I had mentioned it to my husband. He had nodded, made a mental note that I knew would get lost in the clutter of his work emails and client calls. So I took matters into my own hands and called a plumber. He arrived later that afternoon, a little ahead of schedule. I opened the door to find a man standing on my porch, his figure backlit by the harsh afternoon sun. He had the kind of presence that made the air seem charged, as if he carried a bit of the storm with him. His clothes were simple. Faded jeans, a t-shirt that clung to his shoulders with the kind of effortless fit that only came naturally. There was a roughness to him, an edge that contrasted sharply with the curated smoothness of my life. His eyes held a hint of mischief, as if he was always on the brink of a joke or a secret. "I'm here about the leak," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through me. I nodded, swallowing the sudden tightness in my throat, and led him into the kitchen. He moved with purpose, setting down his tools and crouching under the sink. His presence filled the room not just with the scent of soap and metal but with something more potent. An energy, a heat that seemed to radiate off him in waves. I busied myself wiping down an already clean counter, pretending not to notice the way his shirt stretched as he reached for his wrench, or the subtle flex of his forearms as he turned the valve. Minutes stretched. I found myself drawn to the rhythm of his work, the steady twist of his wrist, the quiet hum under his breath. I realized I was staring when he glanced up, catching my eye. I looked away too quickly, my cheeks flushing with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "All done," he announced, the sound of his voice breaking the spell. He stood, wiping his hands on a rag, and for a moment we stood there, the space between us shrinking and expanding with the weight of unsaid things. He handed me the invoice, his fingers brushing mine, and the contact was electric. A fleeting, accidental spark that left my skin tingling. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice too soft, too breathy. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips as if he knew more than he let on. And then he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of metal and soap, and a silence that echoed with the phantom beat of my own racing pulse. That night, as I lay next to my husband, his back turned to me, the ceiling seemed to press down with the weight of my thoughts. I closed my eyes, but the image of the plumber lingered. A silhouette framed by sunlight, a low rumble of a voice, a touch that felt like more than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of misplaced curiosity. But deep down I knew better. A drip, soft and steady, had started inside me, and no amount of denial could stop it from becoming a flood. The days after his visit seemed to stretch and fold over themselves, every hour an echo of the last. I found myself lingering in the kitchen more often, as if the walls held the memory of his presence. My routine remained the same: coffee, emails, a walk around the garden. But there was a new undercurrent, a low hum that threaded through every thought. It wasn't obsession, not yet, but it was a slow, creeping itch under my skin that refused to be ignored. My husband moved through our home like a ghost, his attention always a step removed. His touch, when it came, felt like an afterthought. A pat on the shoulder, a quick peck on the cheek, as if I were a colleague, not a lover. I tried to meet him halfway, to draw him into conversations, but our words slid past each other like rain on glass. There were moments when I caught myself watching his profile over the rim of my wine glass, wondering if he felt the same disconnection, or if he had simply grown accustomed to it. The faucet started dripping again. I stood over the sink, the rhythmic plink of water against metal pulling at the fragile strands of my patience. It was as if the house itself had aligned with my own restlessness, its small imperfections rising to the surface. I considered calling someone else, a different handyman, but my fingers seemed to find his number on their own. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice familiar in a way that made my pulse skip. "The leak's back," I said, the words too blunt, my tone too thin. "I'll swing by this afternoon," he replied. No hesitation, no unnecessary politeness. His certainty was a sharp contrast to the lukewarm responses I had grown used to. When he arrived, I noticed the details I had missed before. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the roughness of his knuckles as he pulled his tools from the bag. He moved through my kitchen with the ease of someone who belonged there. I watched him, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, the heat seeping into my palms. There was a comfort in his presence, a solidness that seemed to anchor the room. "It's a stubborn one," he said, his voice carrying from under the sink. I murmured something in response, a vague agreement that hung in the air. He emerged, wiping his hands, and stood too close, not inappropriately but enough that I could feel the warmth of him. The space between us seemed to hold its breath. I offered him a glass of water, my hand brushing his as I passed it to him. The contact was light, a feather's touch, but it set off a cascade of sensation. An echo of the first time, a reminder of that charged moment. His eyes met mine over the rim of the glass, and I saw something there. Curiosity maybe, or a question unasked. "I should go," he said, but his feet didn't move. We stood like that, a tableau of almosts and what-ifs, until the weight of silence pulled us back into motion. He stepped away first, breaking the invisible thread between us, and I felt the loss of it like a sharp inhale. He reached for his tools, his movements slower, deliberate. I opened my mouth, a half-formed excuse on my lips, when he turned back to me. His expression had shifted, softer, a shadow of uncertainty that I hadn't seen before. "If you need anything else," he started, and the words hung between us, fragile and malleable. My mind twisted them into shapes, each possibility more dangerous than the last. I wanted to say something, to reach for the invisible thread again, but my voice failed me. Instead, I nodded, a small, tight movement that felt both like an ending and a beginning. When the door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale. I stood in the empty kitchen, my heartbeat loud in my ears, the taste of unspoken words still sharp on my tongue. I knew I should have felt relief, that I had managed to keep my composure, but all I felt was the ache of missed opportunity. The faucet, newly fixed, remained silent, but the drip inside me continued, steady, relentless, and growing. The days slipped into one another with a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm. My life had become a loop, a sequence of tasks that repeated with little variation. Yet beneath the surface, a current pulled at me, drawing me toward the edges of something I couldn't quite define. It was as if my world had been cast in grayscale, but a single vibrant thread had begun to unravel the monotony, and I couldn't help but tug at it. I tried to push him out of my mind, to box those stray thoughts away and return to the familiar safety of my routine. But every ordinary moment seemed to carry an echo of him. The way he had moved through my kitchen, the warmth of his presence lingering in the air, the quiet confidence in his voice. I caught myself staring out of the window, my eyes unfocused, my mind slipping back to the brief electric contact of our hands. It was as if he had left a fingerprint on my thoughts, a smudge I couldn't wipe away. One afternoon I decided to break the cycle. I needed groceries, an excuse as good as any to step outside and breathe air that didn't taste of old coffee and forgotten promises. The supermarket was its own kind of refuge. Aisles of choices, each small decision a temporary distraction. I wandered slowly, letting my fingers brush over the cool metal of the cart handle, the textures of produce, the smooth glass of a jar. I was grounding myself, reconnecting with the tangible world, when I saw him. He stood a few feet away, his back to me, studying a shelf of canned goods. It was a mundane scene, but my body reacted as if I had walked into a gust of cold air. My breath caught, my skin prickled, and a rush of warmth spread through my chest. He turned, and our eyes met, a collision of reality and the hazy remnants of my daydreams. "Hey," he said, his voice settling over me like a blanket. It was a simple word, casual and unassuming, but it vibrated with an undercurrent of recognition. I forced a smile, my fingers tightening around the handle of my cart. Hi. My voice sounded smaller than I intended, as if it had curled in on itself to hide. We exchanged pleasantries. How small the world was, the inevitability of running into someone when you least expected it. Our conversation wove between the shelves, his steps mirroring mine as we moved slowly through the store. I noticed the way he examined each item, the small, thoughtful frown that creased his brow, the ease with which he spoke. His presence filled the space, turning an ordinary grocery run into something laced with possibility. Need help with those? He asked, nodding toward my basket, which had grown heavier with every unthinking addition. I hesitated, a moment stretched thin and delicate before I nodded. He reached out, his hands brushing against mine as he took the basket. The contact was brief, a spark that singed the air between us. We walked to the parking lot together, the conversation drifting into softer, more personal territory. He told me about a childhood spent in small towns, the way he liked the quiet of early mornings, the satisfaction of fixing things with his hands. I found myself sharing more than I intended, how I often felt trapped in my own life, the weight of expectations that clung to me like damp clothes. He listened, truly listened, and his silence felt like an invitation rather than an absence. At my car, he set the bags in the trunk, his movements careful and unhurried. I felt a pull, a quiet nudge toward him, as if gravity itself had shifted. The world around us had narrowed to this small pocket of space, a bubble where the outside world couldn't intrude. I wanted to say something to extend this moment a little longer, but the words tangled in my throat. Take care, he said, his voice softer now, edged with something unspoken. I nodded, my mouth dry, my pulse a drumbeat beneath my skin. He hesitated, a half step back, and then he was gone, disappearing into the river of cars and people, a ripple that left the air trembling in his wake. I sat in my car for a long time, the keys cold in my hand. I replayed every word, every glance, dissecting the meaning behind each pause. It had been nothing, a coincidence, an ordinary encounter in an ordinary place. But it felt like more. A door left slightly ajar, a breeze pulling me toward the unknown. I knew I should turn the key, start the engine, go back to my life. But my hands remained still, my mind caught in the soft echo of his voice, the quiet promise it held. The world outside the window blurred, and for a moment I allowed myself to linger in that space, suspended between what was and what could be. The days that followed our encounter at the supermarket were marked by an unsettling quiet. My home, once a refuge, began to feel like a stage set, every room a prop in a life that no longer felt entirely mine. I moved through it on autopilot, my body completing tasks while my mind wandered to places it shouldn't. His face lingered at the edges of my vision, a shadow in the corners of my thoughts. I tried to distract myself with chores, burying my hands in soapy water, scrubbing the same spot on the counter until the granite seemed to shine with accusation. I cooked elaborate meals, arranged fresh flowers in vases, folded laundry with the precision of a machine. But nothing filled the hollow space that had opened inside me. My husband noticed my restlessness, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long during dinner, his hand reaching out once, hesitating before settling back onto his lap. He asked if I was okay, his voice edged with genuine concern, and I answered with a practiced smile and a soft, just tired. He accepted it the way he always did, content with the surface and never prying into the depths. Then late one afternoon, the silence of the house was broken by a soft chime. My phone vibrated against the marble counter, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the device, an instinctive caution battling with curiosity. I picked it up, the screen cool and smooth against my skin, and opened the message. Hope the faucet is still behaving, it read. His name wasn't there, but I knew. Of course I knew. My breath caught in my throat, a tightness blooming in my chest that bordered on pain. I typed a response, erased it, then typed again, settling on a non-committal, all good, thanks. I pressed send and stared at the screen, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I set the phone down, but the weight of it pulled at me. I walked away into the living room, then the garden, picking at leaves and dead flowers, my hands needing something to do. But I couldn't escape the pull. His message sat like a stone in my mind, small but heavy, distorting every thought around it. The phone chimed again. I almost ran to it, the anticipation sharp and shameful. His reply was brief, a single line that threaded through my defenses with disarming simplicity. Good to know. Let me know if anything else needs fixing. I read the message over and over, my mind dissecting every word, every space between them. Was it just a polite follow-up? An innocuous offer? Or was there more, a layer beneath the surface that only I could see because I wanted to see it? I didn't respond, letting the words hang in the air, a promise or a warning, I couldn't tell. That evening my husband suggested a movie. We sat side by side on the couch, the glow of the screen casting soft shadows over his face. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm and familiar, but I felt nothing. His touch was a weight, an expectation, and I found myself withdrawing, curling my hand into my lap. He didn't push, his attention sliding back to the movie, his face a mask of contentment. I envied him, his ability to remain whole while I felt myself fracturing, splintering under the surface. The next morning I woke with a decision lodged in my chest. I needed to break the spell, to confront this feeling and either extinguish it or let it burn. I told myself it was about closure, about setting boundaries, but a quieter voice whispered that it was about testing them, seeing how close I could get to the edge without falling. I typed out a message, each word a tiny betrayal. Actually, I think the faucet is leaking again. Could you stop by tomorrow? I stared at the screen, the send button a red line I was about to cross. My thumb hovered, a moment of clarity pushing through the fog. I could delete it, go back to the safety of my routine, to the hollow comfort of the life I knew. But I didn't. I pressed send, and with it I felt the floor shift beneath me. There was no going back, no undoing the choice I had just made. I stood in the kitchen, the room suddenly too small, the walls too close. I had opened a door, and the air on the other side tasted of storms. I took a breath, feeling the electricity gather around me, the promise of something dangerous and new. The faucet remained silent, but the drip inside me continued, steady, relentless, impossible to ignore. When he arrived the next day, the air in the house felt different, heavier somehow. I had spent the morning cleaning, though nothing needed it. The countertops gleamed, the floors were polished to a reflective sheen, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air from a candle I had lit and then extinguished, afraid it might seem too deliberate. I wanted everything to appear natural, but nothing about this felt that way. I opened the door and he stood there, his toolbox in one hand, the other raised in a casual wave. His expression was easy, unreadable, and I envied him that. My own nerves felt like exposed wires, each moment a potential spark. I stepped aside, letting him in, and closed the door softly behind him. The click of the latch seemed louder than usual, final, like a line being drawn. "The faucet?" he asked, his voice steady, the undercurrent of his tone as calm as still water. I nodded, words catching in my throat. He moved into the kitchen and I followed, my steps careful as if I were walking on ice. He crouched under the sink, his shoulders broad, the fabric of his shirt pulling tight across his back. I forced myself to look away, my hands finding the cold edge of the counter. I pressed down, grounding myself, feeling the hard surface beneath my palms. The room was filled with the soft sounds of his work. The clink of metal, the shuffle of tools, the quiet hum he made under his breath. It was a melody without notes, a rhythm that found its way under my skin. "Seems fine to me," he said, his voice muffled as he twisted his body to look up at me. I didn't move, couldn't. His eyes held mine and I felt the pull again, the gravity that had been building between us. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth, the movements unhurried, deliberate. The silence pressed against us, filling the space between words, between breaths. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He stepped closer, not much, just enough that I could see the way his pulse moved under the skin of his throat. My own heartbeat mirrored it, a syncopated rhythm that drummed in my ears. His hand moved, a small gesture, and his fingers brushed against mine on the counter. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through me, a ripple on the surface of still water. For a moment, everything narrowed, the room, the world, the years of my life that had led me to this exact point. His face was close, his breath warm against my skin, and I realized I was holding my own, suspended in that fragile space between impulse and action. His lips touched mine, softly at first, a question more than a statement. And I answered, not with words but with the tilt of my head, the press of my mouth against his. The kiss deepened, a slow burn that moved through me, uncoiling the tightness in my chest, filling the empty spaces I had carried for so long. When we pulled apart, the world rushed back in sharp and loud. I took a step back, my hands finding the edge of the sink, the cool metal biting into my skin. He looked at me, his expression a mix of calm and caution, as if he was waiting for me to redraw the line or erase it completely. I opened my mouth, the need to say something, anything clawing at me, but I couldn't find the right shape for the words. "I should go," he said, his voice gentle, not a retreat but an offering. I nodded, my throat too tight, my voice lost somewhere between my heart and my mouth. He moved to the door, his steps measured, giving me space, giving me time. I followed, my feet carrying me forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. At the door he turned, his hand resting on the handle. The sun outside cast a soft light around him, a halo that felt too bright, too real. I wanted to reach out to hold on, but my hands remained at my sides, fingers curling into my palms. "Take care," he said, his voice a low murmur that wrapped around me. And then he was gone, the door closing with a quiet click, a punctuation mark on the moment we had created. I stood there, the cool draft of air brushing against my skin, the taste of him still lingering on my lips. The silence of the house returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty, it was full of echoes, of possibilities, of the soft hum of a melody that had no end. I turned away from the door, my feet moving of their own accord, leading me back into the kitchen, to the faucet that no longer dripped, to the counter where his touch still lingered like a ghost. I closed my eyes and the world around me held its breath, waiting for the next move, the next step, the next drop in the quiet, inevitable flood. After he left, the house settled into an unsettling stillness. I moved through the rooms, my body following familiar paths while my mind lingered in that moment by the kitchen counter. His touch, the warmth of his breath against my skin, the lingering taste of his lips, it all hung in the air like the last notes of a song. I replayed every detail over and over, until the edges of reality blurred and I couldn't tell where my thoughts ended and my desires began. My husband came home late that night. He moved quietly through the house, his presence a soft intrusion on the fragile calm I had built in his absence. He found me in the living room, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in over an hour. He sat beside me, his weight shifting the cushions, and I felt the pull of his presence, the familiar gravity of our life together. "Long day?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost hesitant. I nodded, my response automatic. He reached over, his hand resting on my knee, the warmth of his palm seeping through the thin fabric of my dress. I forced a smile, the expression tight and brittle. His thumb moved in slow circles, a gesture meant to comfort, but it only deepened the ache inside me. I felt the disparity, the gap between his touch and the one I craved. His hand was a reminder of what was expected of me, of the roles we played in our carefully constructed life. He leaned closer, his lips brushing my temple, a whisper of affection that felt distant. I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my eyelids a refuge from the closeness of his breath. I felt his intentions before he spoke them, the shift in his posture, the softening of his voice. "Maybe we could go away for a weekend?" he suggested. "Just us. A change of scenery might do us good." His words hung between us, a lifeline thrown too late. I knew what he wanted, to bridge the gap, to pull me back into the orbit of our marriage. And maybe part of me wanted it too. The part that remembered the comfort of routine, the safety of love without complication. But the other part, the part that had felt the rush of something new, something dangerous, it twisted away, unwilling to be caught. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. His hand slipped away, the connection severed, and he stood, his disappointment a quiet presence that followed him down the hallway. I remained on the couch, the fabric cool against my skin, the room heavy with the ghosts of my unspoken thoughts. The next morning I woke to a gray sky. The clouds pressed low, smudging the world with their damp shadows. My husband had already left for work, his side of the bed cool and undisturbed. I lay there for a moment, the sheets tangled around my legs, the quiet of the house pressing in. My phone lay on the nightstand, its screen dark, but I reached for it, my fingers moving with a purpose that belied the hesitation in my chest. I typed out a message, my thumb hovering over the send button, the words a bridge to a place I wasn't sure I should go. "Are you free today?" Simple, direct, an open door. I sent it before I could change my mind, the soft whoosh of the message a quiet betrayal against the morning's stillness. The reply came quickly, his response as straightforward as always. Yes. When? I didn't hesitate this time. Now. He arrived half an hour later. I had opened the curtains, letting the gray light wash over the room, softening the edges of reality. When I opened the door, he stood there, his presence filling the space. His expression was unreadable, a calm surface with dark currents beneath. He stepped inside and I closed the door behind him, the soft click of the lock, a sound that settled deep in my bones. We didn't speak. There were no need for words, no room for them in the charged air between us. He moved closer, his hands finding my waist, his touch gentle but certain. I leaned into him, my body recognizing his before my mind had fully caught up. His lips found mine, a quiet surrender, and the world slipped away, leaving only the two of us suspended in the moment. Time stretched, twisted around us, the minutes losing their shape. When he finally pulled back, his hands still resting against my hip, his eyes searched mine. There was a question there, unspoken, and I felt the weight of it, the reality of what we were doing settling over me like a shroud. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his voice a low murmur, a ripple in the stillness. I couldn't answer, not with words, so I let my actions speak. I pressed my lips to his again, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, holding on as if the world outside had ceased to exist. When he left, the house seemed to sigh around me, the walls bearing witness to the choices I had made. I stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street, my breath fogging the glass, a temporary mark on an impermanent world. I turned away, the silence folding around me, a soft, inevitable echo of the path I had chosen. The days that followed seemed to blur together, a muted wash of grays and half-formed thoughts. I moved through my life as if through water, every step slow, every sound muffled. My husband and I settled into a routine of quiet avoidance, our conversations clipped and functional. He asked if I needed anything from the store, if I wanted to go for a walk, if I had seen his blue tie. I answered in monosyllables, nods, and the occasional forced smile, all the while feeling the gap between us widen. I found solace in the small rituals of solitude. The hiss of the kettle, the warmth of a freshly poured cup of tea, the repetitive motion of folding laundry. I craved the order of these tasks, the illusion of control. But beneath it all lay a restlessness, a quiet hum that never ceased. It was him, the thought of him, the memory of his touch, the echo of his voice in the empty rooms of my mind. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky bruised with twilight, my husband suggested a trip. His voice was soft, careful, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. "I've been thinking," he said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, fingers white against the ceramic. "Maybe we could take a weekend away. Just us. It's been a while." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the lines of worry etched into his face, the shadows under his eyes. He was trying, reaching out with the only tools he had. But his touch felt distant, filtered through a fog of expectation and habit. I knew he wanted to fix things, to smooth over the cracks, but I wasn't sure if I wanted them fixed. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice soft, a promise made of mist. He nodded, his expression a mix of hope and resignation. The weight of his love pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, and I felt the urge to run, to escape into the cool night air and let it strip me bare. When he went to bed, I stayed behind, the glow of my phone the only light in the room. My thumb hovered over his number, the screen a doorway, a choice. I typed a message, erased it, then tried again. "Are you free tomorrow?" The response came quickly, a simple yes. My pulse quickened, a small betrayal beneath my skin, a promise wrapped in silence. He stepped inside, his movements unhurried, a calm that only intensified the storm within me. I closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking a quiet punctuation in the charged silence. His eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. The world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the soft rustle of fabric, the slow draw of breath. He spoke first, his voice a low murmur. "You seemed different in your messages." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. I felt exposed, as if he could see through the layers of propriety, straight to the tangled mess beneath. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and the contact was a spark, a tiny ignition that set my nerves alight. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could catch it. His hand tightened around mine, grounding me, anchoring me to the moment. "You don't have to," he said, his thumb tracing slow circles against my skin. Not right now. We moved together, our steps slow, measured, the space between us closing with each breath. His lips found mine, the kiss soft and searching, a question without words. I answered with the tilt of my head, the press of my body against his. It wasn't desperation but something deeper. A need to feel, to connect, to break free of the numbness that had settled over my life. Time became fluid, moments stretching and folding, reality slipping into a haze of sensation. His touch was gentle, his movements careful, as if he were afraid to shatter me. I clung to him, my fingers fisting in the fabric of his shirt, holding on to the one solid thing in a world that had begun to dissolve at the edges. When he left, the house seemed to inhale, the walls expanding as if to fill the space he had occupied. I stood by the window, watching the taillights of his car disappear into the gray of the afternoon. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, a stranger with my own eyes, my own uncertainty. I turned away, my feet carrying me to the kitchen, to the faucet that remained fixed, silent, a reminder of the pretense that had brought him into my life. I ran my fingers over the cool metal, the sensation grounding me. I thought of my husband, his offer of a weekend away, the hope that had edged his voice. I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders, a burden I didn't know how to bear. The choice lay before me, a path splitting into two, each step a question, each breath a gamble. I didn't know which road to take, only that standing still was no longer an option. I closed my eyes, the darkness a temporary refuge, a place where the world and its consequences couldn't reach me. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I felt the pull of the current, the inexorable draw of the tide, leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. The house had taken on a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the soft, comfortable silence of shared evenings or the peaceful lull of a Sunday afternoon. It was a hollow quiet, one that seemed to echo back every thought I tried to bury. My husband moved through this silence like a ghost, his presence a reminder of the distance that had stretched between us. He was kind, thoughtful even, bringing home my favorite tea, suggesting we try a new restaurant, offering a gentle touch as he passed by. But every gesture felt rehearsed, a line from a script he believed would fix us. I went through the motions, nodding, smiling, answering when I needed to. I played the role of the wife he knew, a reflection of the woman I had once been. But inside I felt like a stranger, an imposter in my own life. I woke up each morning with the same gnawing feeling, a dull ache just beneath my ribs, as if my body was bracing itself for a blow. One evening as I cleared the dinner plates, he approached me. His movements were slow, deliberate, his hands finding the edge of the counter as if he needed the support. His expression was soft, his eyes searching my face for something I couldn't give him. "Have you thought more about the trip?" he asked, his voice careful, every word chosen with the precision of someone trying not to break something fragile. I hesitated, my fingers tight around the ceramic plate. "I don't know if it's the right time," I said. The excuse tasted bitter on my tongue, a half-truth veiled in practicality. His shoulders slumped, just a fraction, but it was enough to make my chest tighten with guilt. "It might help us," he said. "Get away from everything. Just us." His voice was a threadbare hope unraveling between us. I knew he meant well, that he was trying to reach me, but I couldn't find the path back to him. It was as if the door between us had closed and I stood on the other side, staring through a window that distorted everything into shapes I no longer recognized. "I'll think about it," I whispered, and he nodded, the movement small, a resigned acceptance. He left the room and the silence rushed back in, filling the space he left behind. The next morning I stood by the window, my phone cool against my palm. I scrolled through messages, past reminders and unanswered texts until I reached his name. My thumb hovered, a quiet hesitation, and then I typed, "Can we meet?" The response was quick, a single word that sent a ripple through the still water of my resolve. "When?" "Today," I replied, and the word sat on the screen, a pebble in the calm. I set the phone down, my hands shaking, and moved through the house, gathering the pieces of myself that still felt real. When he arrived, the sky had begun to gray, a soft drizzle misting the windows. I opened the door and his presence washed over me, steady and warm. He stepped inside, his movements unhurried, the sound of the door closing behind him a quiet punctuation to the decision I had made. We sat in the living room, the space between us filled with unspoken words. He looked at me, his expression open, patient. I struggled to find the right words, the truth tangled with the lies I had told myself. I feel lost, I said finally, the admission slipping out fragile and raw. His brow furrowed, a gentle crease of concern. What do you need? He asked, his voice a soft thread, pulling me closer to the edge of honesty. I didn't know how to answer. I needed more than I could name, more than I could fit into the tidy boxes of our lives. We sat there, the rain a soft murmur against the glass, the room a cocoon of warmth and quiet. His hand found mine, his touch grounding me, and I let myself lean into it, into him. There was a gentleness to the way he moved, an understanding that settled over me, a balm against the ache I had carried for so long. When he kissed me, it wasn't with urgency but with a slow, deliberate care. His lips brushed mine, a soft pull, and I felt something inside me shift. It was as if he had reached through the layers of doubt and fear, touching the part of me that still believed in possibility. I closed my eyes, letting the world narrow to the space between us, the softness of his mouth, the warmth of his breath. Time seemed to stretch, each moment a bead on a string slipping through my fingers. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, I felt the weight of reality press down on us. I opened my eyes and his face was so close, his expression a mirror of my own uncertainty. What now? He asked, his voice barely more than a breath. I didn't have an answer, not yet. The path forward was hazy, the ground beneath us unsteady. But for the first time in a long while I felt the spark of something real, a small flame in the dark. I don't know, I said. But I want to find out. It was the truth, small and imperfect, but it was enough. His hand tightened around mine, and I felt the echo of my words settle between us, a promise wrapped in the quiet of the room. The rain continued its soft rhythm, a gentle patter that seemed to match the beat of my heart. And in that moment, with the world wrapped in gray and the warmth of his hand in mine, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, the silence could hold something more than just the absence of sound. Could hold a beginning. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the silence that hums with the weight of things unsaid. I found myself drawn to the quiet, slipping into it as if it could shield me from the consequences of my choices. The house became a sanctuary of stillness, its walls a thin barrier against the outside world. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, my presence barely leaving a mark. My husband was gentle with me, his kindness a double-edged blade. He didn't push, didn't demand answers to questions he was too afraid to ask. Instead, he hovered on the edges of my solitude, offering soft smiles and warm cups of tea, his gestures full of quiet hope. I knew he saw the distance in my eyes, felt the chill in my touch, but he held on to the image of us, of the life we had built, as if he could will it back to life through sheer force of love. I envied him that hope. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, but my hands remained at my sides, weighed down by the gravity of my choices. I stood at the window watching the world move outside, the slow crawl of cars, the easy rhythm of passing strangers. I felt untethered, adrift, my life a series of disconnected moments. The clarity I had once sought seemed further away than ever, a mirage on the horizon of my mind. I thought of him, the man who had stepped into my life and shifted its axis. His presence was like a pebble dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outwards, touching everything, changing the shape of my world. He had offered me something I hadn't realized I was searching for, a glimpse of who I could be, of the life I could live beyond the confines of what I had always known. But with that glimpse came fear, a deep and gnawing uncertainty. What if this was just an escape? A fleeting distraction from the monotony of my life? What if the connection I felt was nothing more than a shadow, a reflection of my own loneliness? I wrestled with these thoughts, turning them over in my mind, examining them from every angle. I wanted answers, but all I found were more questions, each one a thread that unraveled the fabric of my certainty. I began to see my life as a series of choices, each one a step on a path that had led me here. I thought of the girl I had been, the dreams I had once held close, the person I had lost along the way. I had built a life on compromise, on quiet sacrifices, on the careful balancing of needs and desires. And somewhere in that careful construction I had misplaced myself. I spent hours in the garden, my hands buried in the soil, the cool earth grounding me. I pulled weeds, pruned branches, shaped the wildness into order. It was a small thing, but it gave me a sense of control, a reminder that change, however small, was possible. I let my mind wander, my thoughts unfurling like the petals of the flowers I tended. I found solace in the simple act of creation, in the quiet persistence of growth. My husband joined me one afternoon, his presence a gentle intrusion on my solitude. He sat beside me, his hands resting in his lap, his silence a question I couldn't answer. We sat like that for a long time, the sun casting long shadows across the garden, the air filled with the soft hum of life. I felt his need for connection, his quiet longing, and it tugged at something deep within me. "I miss you," he said finally, his voice soft, the words slipping out like a secret. I didn't respond, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to bridge the distance between us. I wanted to tell him that I missed myself too, that I had been lost long before this, before him, before everything. But the truth felt too sharp, too raw to share. Instead, I reached for his hand, the gesture small but real. His fingers curled around mine, his grip warm and steady. We sat in the fading light, the world around us shifting from day to dusk, the colors bleeding into each other. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, the quiet a balm to the restlessness that had taken root in my soul. In that stillness I felt a flicker of something, hope perhaps, or the beginnings of acceptance. I didn't have all the answers, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the path forward wasn't a straight line, but a winding road with room for mistakes and second chances. I opened my eyes, the garden a tapestry of greens and golds, the world soft and forgiving. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a shift inside me, a loosening of the knots, a breath drawn without the weight of expectation. I turned to my husband, the man who had stood by me through the quiet unraveling of our life. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw not just the man he was, but the man he could be, the partner I needed, the person I wanted to rediscover alongside me. It wouldn't be easy, the road ahead marked by uncertainty and hard conversations. But it was a road, a path, a way forward. And for now that was enough.